force that drives the water through the rocks, drives my red blood. That dries the mouthing streams, turns mine to wax. Oh, the town was waking now, and I heard distinctly insistent over the slow-speaking sea the voices of the town blown up to me. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day.
My name is Hannah Ellis, and I'm Dylan Thomas's granddaughter. My mother Ironwe spent her childhood in Larne, this beautiful yet quirky sea town. She died 5 years ago, and we scattered her ashes at the boathouse, the family home that had created some of her happiest memories. This moment was the beginning of my journey to understand more about my grandfather, a poet who's known and loved across the world, but died at only 39 years of age.
Like many of you, I thought I already knew Dylan Thomas. He was the roaring Welsh boyo, cigarette in his mouth, drink in his hand, and an irresistible charm with the ladies. I very quickly realised that this Dylan was just a character created by my grandfather, and the legendary stories were exaggerated and embellished as the years went on.
All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys. It was air, and playing lovely and watery, and fire green as grass.
I have come to appreciate what a meticulous craftsman my grandfather was. His writing could take hours, days, weeks, and often years to complete. His poetry and prose were not rushed off in the pub, as the myths would make you believe. They were the result of dedication and hard work.
My grandfather was always most productive when living in Wales. His letters, stories and poetry are full of wonderful descriptions of the land, sea and people he met. This is my Welsh journey, using my favourite pieces of his work to guide us through the magical places that inspired him so much, following in the footsteps of my grandfather, Dylan Thomas.
This is 5 Cwmdonkin Drive, the middle-class house in the uplands area of Swansea, where my grandfather grew up and which is now preserved as a visitor attraction. Both his parents were from Carmarthenshire and were Welsh speakers, but Welsh was not the language of the home, though Dylan heard it often and absorbed its rhythms. His father, DJ, or Jack to the family, was a gifted English master at Swansea Grammar School and had a huge influence on Dylan's love of language and literature. But I also feel a strong connection with his mother, Florence.
A lot has been made about how Dylan was pampered by his mother and various aunts. But I'm a mum too, and I rather suspect I overindulge my son. I understand Florence's deep desire to want to encourage her talented child, but equally, like all mothers, she wanted to protect him.
There's no doubt that all his life, Dylan loved security and liked being cosseted and looked after. In the warm embrace of this house, surrounded by his father's books and his mother's affection, he could start to dream his dreams and practice with words.
This whole house has been lovingly restored, but most of all, I like this tiny bedroom. It was here that Dylan spent hours furiously writing, doodling and experimenting with language, right up until he was recognised as a striking new voice in the poetry world.
Just up the road from the house is Cwmdonkin Park. In Dylan's childhood, this much-loved hillside park had a bandstand and a lake. and through the trees, it gave him stunning views of Swansea Bay and the Mumbles. It was a magical green world for the young boy to explore, play in and act out adventures. A place for making dens in bushes.
Quite near where I lived, so near that on summer evenings I could listen in my bed to the voices of older children playing ball on the sloping, paper-littered bank. The park was full of terrors and treasures. It held within its borders of old tall trees, notched with our names and shabby from our climbing, as many secret places, caverns and forests, prairies and deserts, as a country somewhere at the end of the sea. And though we would explore it one day, armed and desperate from end to end, from the robber's den to the pirate's cabin, the highwayman's inn to the cattle ranch, or the hidden room in the undergrowth where we held beetle races and lit the wood fires and roasted potatoes and talked about Africa and the makes of motor cars, yet still the next day it remained as unexplored as the poles, a country just born and always changing.
Dylan wrote warmly about his uplands childhood. But another magical place for him was his parents' home patch in the Carmarthenshire countryside, near Llanstefan. Everywhere in this peninsula there were relatives, and my grandfather would come here regularly to visit his loving Auntie Annie and her wayward husband Jim, down at their large farmhouse called Fern Hill. Here, in the long days of summer, he left Swansea far behind and entered another world. The house has gone through changes, but it's still surrounded with the atmosphere of Dylan's writing.
There's a strange, surreal quality to many of my grandfather's short stories, and one of them, The Peaches, is based here at Fern Hill. In the story, he's not at all complimentary about his Uncle Jim, the idle and feckless farmer, and he's equally harsh about his cousin Gwilym, who is a mix of preacher and sex-obsessed young man, whose private chapel is a barn.
I sat on the hay and stared at Gwilym preaching and heard his voice rise and crack and sink to a whisper and break into singing and Welsh and ring triumphantly and be wild and meek. The sun through a hole shone on his praying shoulders, and he said, "O God, thou art everywhere, all the time, in the dew of the morning, in the frost of the evening, in the field and the town, in the preacher and the sinner, in the sparrow and the big buzzard. Thou canst see everything right down deep in our hearts. Thou canst see us when the sun is gone. Thou canst see us when there aren't any stars, in the gravy blackness, in the terrible shadows, pitch black, pitch black. Thou canst see everything we do, in the night and day, in the day and the night, everything, everything. Thou canst see all the time. Oh, God, man, you're like a bloody cat."
But the strongest connection between this beautiful place and Dylan's work is his world-famous poem, Fern Hill, which he wrote after the Second World War. His blissful memories of childhood freedom were a contrast with the dark days of the war. And nobody wrote about childhood better than Dylan Thomas.
My grandfather was able to return to Fern Hill in his imagination, back to the deep countryside place where he was ecstatically happy and without the responsibilities of adult life. This vivid sense of escape, returning to a lost childhood, is why I think people love this poem so much.
All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys. It was air, and playing lovely and watery, and fire green as grass. And nightly, under the simple stars, as I rolled to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the nightjars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm, like a wanderer white with the dew, come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining. It was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light, in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable on to the fields of praise.
Above all, my grandfather was a Swansea writer, and he knew the town inside out, its spirit, its gossip, and its secrets. He left school at 16 and spent 18 months as a reporter on the Evening Post newspaper. But the job was just a way to keep him going while he filled notebooks with poems that were soon to amaze the world.
I'm always astonished by how young my grandfather was when his poetic career took off. He was only 18 when he was first published and noticed in London, and only 20 when his first collection appeared.
It was an amazing burst of creativity, intense and original. The poems of this time are dramatically full of life, death and sex, and reveal the confusing questions and emotions of a young man.
The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age, that blasts the roots of trees, is my destroyer. And I am dumb to tell the crooked rose, my youth is bent by the same wintry fever. The lips of time leach to the fountain head. Love drips and gathers, but the fallen blood shall calm her sores. And I am dumb to tell a weather's wind how time has ticked a heaven round the stars. And I am dumb to tell the lover's tomb how at my sheet goes the same crooked worm.
So Dylan Thomas's career as a writer was launched. In the 1930s and 40s, he was always on the move, always wanting to be back in Wales, but needing to be in London to work and make money. And so he met my grandmother, the Bohemian Irish dancer Catlin who was an extraordinary mixture of wild and passionate woman, but wonderful home builder.
Dylan wrote remarkable short stories and also radio scripts, appearing on BBC Radio many times from the late 1930s to the end of his life. He was a terrific broadcaster, spinning rich and colourful images on the airwaves.
Some entered the town in the dark and immediately disappeared, and can sometimes be heard on hushed black nights making noises in ruined houses. Or perhaps it is the white owls breathing close together like ghosts in bed.
During the early years of the war, Dylan witnessed the death and devastation of the Blitz in London, and also in his hometown of Swansea. It drove deep into his poetry and prose. There's a very touching radio script called Return Journey, where he looks for his younger self in a bombed and wintry Swansea.
Near the Evening Post building and the fragment of the castle, I stopped a man whose face I thought I recognized from a long time ago. I said, "I wonder if you can tell me..." "Yes?" He peered out of his blanketing scarves and from under his snowballed balaclava like an Eskimo with a bad conscience. I said, "If you can tell me whether you used to know a chap called young Thomas. He worked on the post and used to wear an overcoat sometimes with the check lining inside out so that you could play giant drafts on him. He wore a conscious woodbine, too. What do you mean, conscious woodbine? And a perched pork pie with a peacock feather. And he tried to slouch like a newshawk, even when he was attending a meeting of the Gosainen Buffaloes. Oh, him! He owes me £0.50. God, I haven't seen him since the old Cardoma days. He wasn't a reporter then. He just left the grammar school. Him and Charlie Fisher. Charlie's got whiskers now. And Tom Warner and Fred James. Drinking coffee dashes and arguing the toss. What about? Oh, music and poetry and painting and politics. Einstein and Epstein. Stravinsky and Greta Garbo. Death and religion. Picasso and girls.
Wales was always calling Dylan. It was always home. Yes, parts of Wales had small-town attitudes and the nonconformist hypocrisy that drove him crazy. But it also had the eccentric characters he loved so much and the magical landscape of seas, harbours and estuaries. For the best part of a year, from 1944 to 45, Dylan, Catlin and my mum lived here in Newquay, overlooking the stunning bay. This period gave Dylan the peace and tranquility he so often craved, and it saw another burst of astonishing creativity, helped by friends and patrons. He was even given a bolt hole, now ruined, in which he could write.
Just like at home in Swansea, where he had his tiny bedroom to work in, and in Larne, where he worked in the writing shed, here in Newquay, he had this place to work in, the apple house, set in a beautiful garden.
It was here that the early stirrings of Under Milkwood began, and there's no doubt that the town of Clwregib in the play, with its extraordinary characters, owes a great deal to Newquay. He wrote about one of them in a letter to his patron, Margaret Taylor.
Jack the Post is an old friend. He once married a pretty widow in London, and everything was fine, he said, except that wherever they went, they were followed by men in bowler hats. After the honeymoon, Mrs. Jack was arrested for double bigamy, and all the husbands appeared in the court and gave evidence as to her good character.
Soon, characters like these appeared in a radio script called Quite Early One Morning, which was broadcast in 1945, 8 years before the completion of Under Milkwood.
I am Miss May Hughes, the cosy, a lonely lady, waiting in her house by the nasty sea, waiting for her husband and pretty baby to come home at last from wherever they may be. I am Captain Tiny Evans. My ship was the Kidwelly, and Mrs. Tiny Evans has been dead for many a year. Poor Captain Tiny, all alone, the neighbours whisper. But I like it all alone, and I hated her. Parchedig Thomas Evans, making morning tea. Very weak tea, too. You mustn't waste a leaf. Every morning making tea in my house by the sea. I am troubled by one thing only, and that, belief. Open the curtains, light the fire, what are servants for? I am Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, and I want another snooze. Dust the china, feed the canary, sweep the drawing-room floor. And before you let the sun in, mind he wipes his shoes. Thus, some of the voices of a cliff-perched town at the far end of Wales moved out of sleep and darkness into the newborn, ancient and ageless morning, moved and were lost.
But of course Larne was the other great source for under Milkwood. It's a very distinctive place, snuggled by the sea and hidden away from the main thoroughfares of Wales. It had always been a part of Dylan's life, with its dramatic views across the estuary towards the Llanstefan Peninsula, where he spent those childhood summers in Fern Hill. He and Catlin lived here from time to time, eventually settling in the boathouse, bought for them by Margaret Taylor, who wanted to provide the Thomases with a place where Dylan could work and where they could have the chance of a stable family life. It's now a focal point for lovers of his work from across the world.
I like to imagine the boathouse as a home. I like to think about it as it was 65 years ago when the Thomases lived here. Children playing, washing on the line, babies crying, all coming together to make a chaotic yet fun place to be. The boathouse is such an incredibly important place for my family. Perhaps you can understand why we scattered my mum's ashes here.
Her place of burial was a place of so much life, but we also put a bench here with a message for anyone who sits down to enjoy the stunning view from the boathouse.
We felt this was appropriate because we do keep coming back again and again. And when people sit on this bench and look across at the stunning views of the estuary, they too will feel exactly the same way.
It seems fitting that I should end my journey here at Dylan's writing shed, just along from the boathouse. I really do hope I've been able to show you a different side of my grandfather, the way he was away from the busy cities, happy and free in the beautiful surroundings of the Welsh sea towns. In particular, I wanted to show you the wealth and many types of writing he created in just 39 years. It's my wish that we can celebrate my grandfather's achievements, and you will realise that he was an ambitious, hard-working and successful writer. His work will live on.